Hey, how's it going?
Just going pretty well. It has just been very dark all weekend, and we
Mm,
finally just saw the sun poke through the clouds. And to be honest, when it is dark and sunless, my emotional well-being struggles a little bit. And so
mm.
seeing the sun poke through the clouds is just thrilling me right now.
And yeah, wow. So it is going to be sunless in my neck of the woods for about 6 months. And as much as I want you to move to Oregon, seasonal affective disorder is a real thing, and people around here really have to work their way through the long, dark 6 month slog of late fall, winter, early spring.
Yeah. No, it's tough. I mean, I've got a light box. It genuinely helps. I'll start taking vitamins here now that we're into this season that have like vitamin D in them and all those kinds of things. But man, I am just glad when the sun comes back. But
Yeah, yeah.
how about you? How are you doing?
I am glad to be on my weekend. Yeah. I think I've said that a lot lately. I think I've just been working a lot. So I'm glad to be on my weekend. I've got podcasting with you today and then a little bit of prep for the sermon prep team for my church and then my own sermon prep because I'm going to be preaching at another church in a couple of weeks. So it's all, and then I'm just going to pick up my son and go to the gym. So it's going to be a good day.
Awesome. That sounds great.
Yeah. But I'm excited for this conversation.
Yes, I was reading a book I mentioned a while back, and I want to get a chance to talk about it with you. So, this is Dane Ortland's book, Gentle and Lowly. It was recommended to me by one of the folks who follows us on Threads, and
Hmm.
I am so grateful because it is a phenomenal book, and I am super excited to kind of dig into it. But before digging into it, I have to kind of set it up by explaining the category of book.
Okay.
Yeah, because when I go to a book, normally I'm looking for the book to inspire me to think new and different thoughts. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like I am also currently reading Michael Gorman's Cruciformity, which is his sort of
Oh,
theology of Paul,
yeah.
and it is brilliant and beautiful and inspiring. It's just amazing. Have you read this?
I have read parts of it. I have never like sat down and read the whole book. I have perused it for papers that I've written, but no, I've not read it in its entirety, and I'm dying to.
Oh, it's so good. And it really kind of connects well with the Revelation series we did last year in terms of themes. So it's been a really wonderful read. But that is one kind of book, new and different thoughts, helping me see God or the world differently. Dane Ortland's book is a different kind of book than that. This is a book that is helping me to think more about a topic that I already know a lot of the information, but it doesn't feel like it's gotten worked out into my day-to-day life.
Yeah. In some ways, those kinds of books are more challenging because I find myself in one of two responses with those types of books. Either on the one side, I don't give it the time that it deserves. And I go, yeah. I already know. Okay. Thank you for a
Mm-hmm.
book that tells me nothing I didn't already know. Or I let it sink in and I go, oh man, I do not live in light of that. And it's almost like defeating to read. And so either way, I haven't had like just a good, not, I don't know. It's rare for me to have a good, healthy response to a book like that.
Well, and I'll be honest, I lean into the second of those two responses. This is very much why I wanted to have a conversation about this.
Hmm.
Sometimes I read a book that's in this. So I'm going to call this genre of book meditative,
Okay.
right? This is, in my head, that's kind of what I call these are meditations on a topic. And when I read a book that's meditative, I often have the first response you talked about. I kind of just get bored with it and dismiss it and burn through it as quick as I can. And then if I don't do that, I think my response is, oh, now what do I do? Like, I can feel the need for it, and yet just reading the book was not adequate. And so that is exactly why I want to have a conversation about this topic today and this book today.
Okay.
Because this is the kind of book that I think is not just important, wildly important. And yet it is a topic that I have tried to grab onto for much of my adult relationship with God and still feel like I am wrestling to do well or to engage with wholeheartedly.
Well, I'm super intrigued by that lead up because the title Gentle and Lowly doesn't give much away, in my opinion. Like, I'm eager to find out what you're going to say next, because gentle and lowly doesn't seem on its surface like something of that big of significance.
Yeah, absolutely. And so let me dive in, and periodically I'm going to pause and say, okay, what the heck do we do with this?
Okay.
That's kind of the approach I want to take here. But so here's the idea. I think that this is a series of sermons. I think Ortlund is a pastor. I think this is a series of sermons that got turned into a book. And the first chapter, each chapter being one of the sermons. And the first chapter really sets the stage. He starts off by saying, and I think this is fascinating. He says, there aren't many times when Jesus tears back the curtain and allows us to see straight into his heart and know the nature of his heart. But one of those places is Matthew 11:28-30, where it says, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." And the essence of the book surrounds this idea that, first of all, and I think I shared this in a thought several months back, when we think about Jesus, our primary theological exploration is into the work that he has done on our behalf. What Ortlund wants to do is dig into the nature of Jesus, who Jesus is as a person and as a being. What is his heart? And it's interesting. He describes heart as the central animating center of all that we do. So what is at the core of Jesus' nature? And this verse, these two words, gentle and lowly, are one of, if not the only, Ortlund claims it's the only time Jesus says, this is what my heart is like. I am by nature, at the core of my being, I am gentle and lowly.
So, I mean, I imagine you've got so many things about what are the ramifications for your life and how you want to live into that. But I'm hearing the words gentle and lowly, and I'm just wondering, what in the world does lowly mean? Gentle, I think we can get, but what does he mean by lowly?
Yeah, both of these he gives interesting descriptions of. So for gentle, he says it's the same word as in the Beatitudes, the word meek. It's the opposite of being harsh or reactionary, which is deeply challenging to me because I am a harsh person by nature. Like, I have to work really hard not to be reactive. But lowly, and this is the one that I thought was interesting, lowly here it's not the word that we would associate with the virtue of humility. Rather, it really speaks to the circumstances a person is in. This is a person who has been sort of thrust down or pressed down. And when Ortlund is trying to summarize what this word really means, he says it means that Jesus is accessible.
like a man of the people kind of thing?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. This is somebody who is not looking down their nose at you. This is somebody who, when Jesus is hanging out with tax collectors and sinners, he feels fully comfortable at home himself because that is naturally where he is gravitating towards.
It's interesting the timing of that, because I was trying to think of like what it means to be cast down or in a lowly position. And I was thinking about he didn't consider equality with God something to be grasped, but he made himself nothing, emptying himself and taking on the form of a servant. And I was thinking, okay, so this is just Jesus, stepping down from his exalted position in heaven and becoming a human. And that is lowly. But then you took it even further. So that was what was in my head. And then you said, he's comfortable with tax collectors and sinners. And I thought, oh, he's not just God stepping in as a human. He's a human willing to be with the least loved humans on the planet.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and this is where, as Ortlund goes on to build what this means, one of the points he makes in the next chapter is that we often think of compassion as an interruption of Jesus' nature, right? Like he's normal. And this is, I think, one of my first questions here is, what is your instinctive assumption about Jesus' nature? Like, how is Jesus reacting? Is such an interesting question if we can answer it authentically. And I know for me, if I think of Jesus as anything, I think of him as either aloof or aggravated, right? Like, I think not theologically, right? Like, I'm not trying to say I think that Jesus is an angry person, but I definitely think Jesus has to work at being kind. And this is exactly it. When Jesus is accessing his compassion or mercy, or when I have to access his compassion or mercy, this is one of the analogies that Ortlund uses. He says, should we draw on the mercy of Christ cautiously, in a measured way, as if it were an oxygen tank that might run out? Or shall we withdraw on it lavishly?
Mm.
When I look at the way I respond to God, often I think I treat God's mercy, Christ's mercy, like it were an oxygen tank. And I better save as much for later because I might need it.
Yeah. It makes me think of, the concept was introduced to me by somebody, and I don't know who. But when Jesus is responding to the Pharisees, he is responding out of love and not out of aggravation. Because if there were anybody on the planet that was by nature most closely theologically aligned with Jesus, it would have been the Pharisees. They're the ones desiring the kingdom of God to come and believing that the way to do that is to live into a life of holiness. And they're just so misguided about it that maybe Jesus isn't responding in aggravation to the Pharisees. He's responding in love and in gentleness and an invitation to say, guys, read the scriptures again. Go back and look. This is all right there. You guys know this stuff. You just aren't willing to see it. And I have appreciated that approach, and the jury's out for me in terms of like, is that what Jesus is saying? But I think what it shows me is that a printed word has no tone. And we apply a tone of voice to Jesus's words, whether we want to or not. And when we read those printed words and the things that he said or did, we assume a tone or a manner in which he did them. And we may well be wrong about that tone or that manner.
Absolutely. No, I had this experience with someone who was not a native English speaker. This was maybe 5 or 10 years ago. I was speaking about the phrase that Jesus used and really wrestling with the phrase that Jesus used, "Oh, you of little faith,"
Mm.
which again, I hear as I have run out of patience with you. Come on, you people. And this person who was a native Spanish speaker from South America or Central America somewhere, she was saying, "Oh, that's so weird that you hear it that way, because when it translates into Spanish, it sounds far more like a sort of teasing pet name."
Yeah. Which is the way it reads in Greek too, because it doesn't say, "Oh, ye of little faith." It just says little faiths. I mean, and it's the plural form of little faith. And that's it. It doesn't say you of anything at all. It just little faiths. And so I totally see. I think Spanish probably has the better translation.
Yeah. And so I think you're spot on right. And even I've wondered if sometimes Jesus' closeness with the Pharisees, even if he is getting frustrated with them, if it doesn't come out of a sense of connection rather than a sense of disconnect. I am,
Sure.
When I think someone can be convinced, I have very specific opinions on in the political sphere. When someone is in my camp on or 90% of things and diverges from me on a political thing, it drives me crazy. And I'm like, what is wrong with you? But when I don't agree with somebody on anything and they diverge from that same exact political point, I'm just like, oh yeah, that's just you. Yeah, I have zero interest. I don't care. Whatever. Do whatever you're going to do. Sometimes it's the closer we are to people, that the more that our heart is sort of pricked by disconnect, which this is not my thought originally. You were saying you didn't remember who introduced you to this. I remember who introduced me to this thought about Jesus and the Pharisees. And it was our professor, Dr. Reeves.
I wondered. Yeah. Okay. That makes perfect sense.
He used the phrase in his class, Jesus and the Gospels, whatever the class was called. He said, the debates with the Pharisees take the form of in-house debates. And he wasn't trying to say Jesus was a Pharisee, but he was trying to say these are people Jesus connected with on a lot of levels, not people that he was categorically in opposition to on everything.
Right. And the opposition really came because of the Pharisees. The Pharisees determined to make Jesus their enemy. Not necessarily the other way around.
No, absolutely. And if we just hold on to this relationship, it's such an interesting background, because Ortland's book, he wants to say that the gentle and lowly Jesus, the Jesus who is compassionate and he talks about the word compassion, talks about how it really means from like your deepest organs, from your bowels. Like, and that's where Jesus' compassion is rising from. He talks about how we are either going to see wrath, the frustration and anger of Jesus as an interruption of his normal response, or we are going to see kindness and compassion as an interruption of the normal angry response, that we kind of will lean one way or the other.
Yeah.
And where we lean is going to be deeply determinative of how we respond to Jesus when we realize we have fallen short. And this is the thing that I loved, kind of building on Hebrews 12:2, where it says, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame. One of the arguments he makes is that Jesus' joy is increased when sinners access his mercy and forgiveness. He doesn't kind of erode his patience with us doesn't erode. Instead, he is delighted when we access his mercy and forgiveness.
Wow. Okay. This is so cool. So, boy, this is going to take a second to unpack. This really impacts some things that we were talking about last night. In our community group, we were talking about how God gives various gifts to various people. And the idea of being generous can apply to far more than just money. You can be generous with your time. You can be generous with your knowledge. You can be generous with your compassion. You can be generous with your finances, right? This idea of generosity, and whatever we have in abundance, we want to be able to give generously out of that. And so, and not to say that you should not also give money even when you don't have an abundance, like, or to give any of those things when you don't have an abundance of them. But, just talking about how we all are rich in something. And my youngest son was really struck by that conversation. And so we continued that conversation as we got home. And we were talking about how some people just have an extreme amount of joy in giving out of their abundance, whether that's financial riches, whether that's an overflow of knowledge and study that they want to share with the world, or they love to be compassionate toward people. Like, they're just so joyful to be able to give what they have and to be needed in that way. You know, one small example, my oldest son, is about to get a raise at work, and he was like, "Hey, so I bought a car, and now I'm about to get a raise, and I need to readjust my finances. And Dad, I would love if you would help me set a really good budget, a new budget based on all of these new parameters." And I was so honored that he asked me that. I've got some experience at budgeting, and anyway, he wanted to draw on that. And so anyway, I guess all of that leads me to react to your statement about how God is joyful at us accessing his grace and mercy and forgiveness. That's what he has in abundance. He is so ready to give that. He is joyful about that. That's a cool thing.
It really is. And I suspect this is, at least for me, difficult to think about, because forgiveness and mercy are something that I seldom see in abundance. You know, Jesus once said, "He who is forgiven much forgives much." In my world, at least, the people who are forgiven much tend to forgive much and become codependent.
Huh.
And seeing healthy, generous forgiveness, I don't know that I can think of a lot of firsthand models of what that looks like. And Jesus, of course, is this perfect model of it, but it definitely isn't something that feels familiar to me.
Yeah, I mean, this is your experience with working in the inner city coming through here, because I don't know that I have the same models of what it means for somebody to be forgiven much and then become codependent. I see how that would play out in the context that you have surrounded yourself in, but I can't personally relate to it.
That makes a ton of sense. Yeah, it's just, and I hadn't thought about that, but you're absolutely right, because my initial mental models for this are, I mean, I have known people who have been forgiven much. One of the things I love about going to church with people who are recovering addicts and coming out of prison and things like that is that, man, they know to their core that they are sinners, and they are reveling in the forgiveness of God. And it is amazing. But man, if they are not discipled well, it becomes unhealthy when they try to be a conduit of that grace.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that gets to, one of Paul's points, like, hey, we should not be putting people in a position of leadership too soon here. because, I mean, in his example, he was saying they could get, haughty or boastful about it. But I think there's a host of detrimental things that could happen when we promote somebody a little too soon. We need to let the transformative work of the gospel take its course in somebody before we talk about promoting them to a position of leadership.
Yeah, I would even broaden that out to say not just promoting them to leadership, but even spotlighting them. One of the things that was interesting, we would often, at both churches I was at, we would use testimonies as a way of sharing what God was doing. But putting somebody in the spotlight complicated their lives when they weren't healthy enough. And that was interesting to watch. It was just very complicated. But so for all of that, this idea that Jesus, I mean, think for a moment, one of the questions he asks later on that I think just is so salient here is, how do you think about Jesus' attitude toward that dark pocket of your life that only you know? My gut response when I sin is not to run to Jesus.
Yeah, that's where the initial part of our conversation really hits home for me. This idea of Jesus not just being gentle, but also lowly and comfortable with tax collectors and sinners. This is a safe person to expose those hidden recesses of our heart to.
Yeah. And my suspicion, and I don't know that I have Bible verses for this, but my suspicion is that you discover he's safe after you take the risk, not before. It's not like I have to convince myself he's safe so that the next time I sin, I run to him. The next time I sin, the next time I'm afraid or fearful or whatever, I think that my gut response is going to be just like Adam and Eve, hide in the garden. And if I want to grow in an experiential knowledge of his safety, his lowliness and gentleness, I'm going to have to acknowledge that it doesn't seem natural to me to run to him. And then I'm going to have to do it anyway.
Yeah, it makes me think of, have you read Dr. Reeves's book, Spirituality According to John?
I have not. It's always been on my list, and I had to think for a moment. I have heard you talk about it a lot, not necessarily on the podcast, but I know you have great respect for it. And it just has never quite made it onto my reading.
So he understands the Gospel of John to really be informed by and framed by the scene at the end of chapter 1. The two disciples came to Jesus, and Jesus said, "What do you want?" So this is verse 37. They said, "Rabbi, where are you staying?" And he said, "Come, and you will see." And it's this "come and you will see" motif that echoes throughout John, because what John is doing is just saying, let me lay bare Jesus' life and ministry. Let me just show you who Jesus is. But in order to find out, you have to just come and see. And I think that's what you're saying as well. Like, you have to just put yourself out there and then you discover he's trustworthy. Or you have to come and see and then you will discover that he is the Messiah. You have to just come and see. You have to be discipled by him. You have to live with him. That's the first step. It's the only step. Everything else makes sense after that.
Yeah, absolutely. I really think this is one of the places where our approach to discipleship is sometimes a little off track, because I think we suggest that the order of operations is know and then do. And I think in reality, it is do and then know. You have to try it. Taste and see, come and see. This is the biblical model, is you develop experiential knowledge by experiencing.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
And that's hard. And it's interesting, I started off saying I wanted to talk about this book because there's more to it that I want to wrestle with. And I think for me, this is the piece that I really feel the need for, is the need to look for moments when I want to run or hide
Mm.
or do something else, right? Like the less strong version of this is there are a host of moments when I could spend time with God and I would rather scroll through threads, or I would rather watch a video on YouTube. And there's nothing wrong with those things. But what have I not tasted and not seen if those things seem equally appealing to God?
And I don't know, maybe this is a piece of what you're saying, but I'm picturing all of the times in the Bible where you had to do in order to see, like this come and see idea. But the one that's standing out to me is the moment where the Israelites had to march around the city of Jericho, and they had to get up the next day and they had to do it again. And they had to get up the next day and they had to do it again and again and again. And then when they're all worn out, then they've got to go do it 7 times. And you're going, oh my gosh, how many loops around this darn city are we going to make? And after I'm all worn out, I got to do it 7 times in one day. Just the exhaustion, like that's a lot of commitment to this idea of come and see. It's not as though they got to just come and immediately see. They had to come
That's a good point.
and come and come and come. And eventually they saw the miraculous, but it didn't happen overnight.
Oh man, I think that's a great point. I think in my deeply transactional approach to relating with God, I think I sometimes want to come and see quickly. And when I come quickly and don't see quickly, I feel like I've done my part. And now I've got proof that it didn't work.
Yeah.
And really what needed to happen is I needed to keep coming, because I don't get to define the timeline.
Yeah.
And experiencing is a slow, especially relational experiencing, is a slow journey.
Well, and that's where this idea of Jesus being lowly is sticking with me. Jesus is in the daily slowness. That's a lowly thing to be in. That's a man of the people, present to our lives in the nitty-gritty kind of experience where it's not going to be every day as a transcendent moment. It's slow, it's real, and it builds over time. To me, gentle and lowly is different than majestic and flashy.
Yeah. I came away from reading this book thinking, Jesus, you are so appealing. And there is so much more to knowing you than I've experienced and known. And I want to know you more. And it's, again, coming back to where I started, there's nothing that we have talked about, I think, that's earth shattering, right?
Right.
It's just so good and so important. And I so deeply want it to be the foundation of how I live and work and move and breathe. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't.
Man, this is so good. I'm glad you read the book. I'm glad you made this a topic of conversation and that I could benefit in some way from this book, and hopefully our audience can as well. So I'd love to invite the audience to react to this conversation, this book. If you've read it, let us know what your takeaways were. And what do you want to live into as a result of this conversation? We'd love to hear it. If you want to post on Facebook, on Threads, on Instagram, we'd love to hear from you. And you can also write to us at onthephonewithjosh@gmail.com.
Yeah. And the other thing I would love, like I said at the beginning of the conversation, this book was a recommendation from a person who follows us on Threads.
Right.
So thanks to that person. And if there are books that you think, man, this is worth reading, I don't guarantee one of us will read it, but if you recommend it, there's a far greater chance than if you don't. And so we would love to hear books that you'd recommend.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's Gentle and Lowly by Dane Ortland. But now, Josh, I want to turn the conversation to you. I'm sure you're thinking about things this week. I am so interested to hear, what have you been thinking about?
Yeah, so we mentioned earlier in the podcast that as we record today, it is early November, but it's actually November 4th as we record today. And I know we're not releasing this until early January, but it is the day before the election. And all across the country, cities are gearing up for civil unrest. And in a lot of ways, that unrest is likely to happen regardless of how the election goes. And I know at our 911 center, we are also making preparations for the turmoil around the election. And it's going to be interesting. As we release this, I don't know what will have transpired. But as we release this, we'll also be looking ahead toward Inauguration Day, which is yet another moment where civil unrest is possible. And I think about our Revelation study and how God is so much greater than the rulers of Babylon, and how God's kingdom is supreme and all of the nations of the earth are beneath him. But it all kind of came home for me. My friend and I just finished translating Psalm 46. And Psalm 46 could not be more appropriate to a moment in time when we think about an election and major civil unrest all across our country as a result of that election. So if you don't mind, I would love to just with have that in mind as I read my translation of Psalm 46.
Yeah, absolutely.
God is our refuge and strength, a helper always found in time of need. Therefore, we will not fear when the earth shakes and the mountains totter into the heart of the sea. Though its waters roar and foam and the mountains quake at its rising. Selah. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy dwelling place of the Most High. God is in the city. The city will not be shaken. God helps the city at the break of dawn. The nations were in turmoil. The kingdoms tottered. He gave forth his voice, and the earth melted. Yahweh of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Selah. Come, behold Yahweh's deeds, who has caused desolations on the earth. He puts an end to wars until the end of the earth. He breaks the bow, smashes the spear, and burns the chariots in fire. Relax and know that I am God. I will be exalted above the nations. I will be exalted above the earth. Yahweh of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Selah. I don't know what's about to transpire, but I'm going to keep this psalm with me.
I am so struck by how sometimes it is the timeless things that are the most timely.
Yeah.
And this is certainly one of those.
Yep.
Just wow.
Yeah. I was blown away by something that was written in Hebrew in Israel 3,000 years ago could be so incredibly relevant to this exact moment.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my thought, and I hope it continues to be my thought. And now I'm turning it back to you. What are your thoughts this week?
Man, well, this is coming from my reflections on what my pastor was preaching on Sunday. Do you remember the story of the 10 lepers and Jesus heals them and one comes back and says, thank you?
Yeah.
So this is a fairly simple thought, but Jesus, when he sends them off, he says, go present yourselves at the temple. And all the Jewish ones go and do that. And the Gentile one doesn't. The Samaritan comes back and presents himself before Jesus and offers thanksgiving and all of those kinds of things. And Jesus' response is, where are the other 9? Wasn't everybody healed? And it's interesting because he gave them a very specific command. Present yourselves at the temple. And I don't know that Jesus was thinking all of this, and I'm certainly not going to, I don't want to assume too much, but it sure seems to me that one leper that came back, Jesus takes his thanksgiving and kneeling before Christ as a fulfillment of the command given.
Mm.
And it's a really, really subtle moment, but I think it is a moment where Jesus is stepping into the place of the temple. And I am struck once again by how our categories for Jesus, is he God or is he human or both? Is there a Trinity? Is incarnation? All of these are not the Jewish categories that Jesus was living in. The category for Jesus that he consistently seems to step into is, I am the temple. And I think when we come to Scripture, and particularly to the Gospels, looking for Jesus to say, I am the temple, there are a host of moments he does, and they are theologically rich, if we allow them to be.
Man, that makes me want to just reread one or many of the Gospels and just look for claims of I am the temple, or stories that point to Jesus as the temple. That is cool.
And I think it answers a really important question. Like when I was a teenager or whatever, one of the questions I had was, why doesn't Jesus just explicitly say that he's God? Like, come on. We make this one of the absolute essentials of our faith. And Jesus says it, but in all these kind of cockeyed ways. And more as I get older, I start to think maybe if we're not getting the right answer from Jesus, we're not asking the right question. So I shouldn't be looking for how does he answer my question? I should be asking, what question does he answer? And the question he's answering in who am I is, I'm the temple, which is a very Jewish way of saying, I am the presence of God on earth.
Yeah.
That's my thought.
Man, sometimes I feel like these thoughts are so good. I just want to sit with them. And then we break it all. We just smash it to pieces by saying, okay, let's make a hard left. Let's do a Which Josh question and end the episode.
But it's fun.
It is fun. It is fun. And I'm actually intrigued by this one, which Josh has family who came through Ellis Island. And this is not me, so now I want to know more about this.
Yeah, so all of my great-grandparents were immigrants in every direction. So I am from the United States only back to my grandparents.
Okay.
My great-grandparents came from Sweden, Italy, Canada, and Poland. And at least the Polish immigrants came through Ellis Island. And I know this because I have a very weird last name. And if you ever see my last name, it is virtually impossible to pronounce. What's awesome about it is that some guy at Ellis Island decided this was how to Americanize my last name. This is not the original Polish spelling. This is what the guy who clearly had been drinking at Ellis Island, he decided, oh, I know how to write that in English, in American, and it's horrible. And so I know every single person with my last name in the whole world because it started with my great grandparents. They got this weird last name from the drunk guy at Ellis Island. And so, first of all, it means everybody who has my last name, we all kind of know each other, at least to some degree. But second of all, I just, it's so, like, really? That's how you'd spell it? I don't understand.
That is awesome. Wow. Yeah. I mean, I know you're making a joke about the fact that the person was drunk, but I think the more probable explanation is that the guy was just so dismissive of your great grandparents and their national origin and their spelling and their heritage and whatever, and was just like, yeah, whatever. I'm going to spell it the way it makes sense to me. It really just doesn't even matter, and just moves these people along. Like, there's just probably some arrogance and cultural arrogance involved, and it probably wasn't intoxication, which is worse.
Yes, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. That's almost certainly exactly what happened. They were just illiterate foreigners. Who knows what they were? They literally could have been doctors and lawyers. But as far as that guy at Ellis Island was concerned, they were illiterate foreigners. So he was going to write down whatever he felt like writing down because he didn't have time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that choice he made has been with me for my entire life, as it was for my father and his father before him for their entire lives.
Yeah. Wow.
So there you go. I have family that came through Ellis Island.
Yeah. Yeah, you do. Awesome. Well, this has been a great conversation today. I really appreciated it.
Yeah. Thank you for letting me process this out. This is exactly why I love these kind of conversations. It just gives me the space to take knowledge and stew on it and let it kind of work its way in a little bit, which is helpful.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. All right. Well, I'm looking forward to another conversation again next week.
All right. I'll talk to you then.
All right.